Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. You know, one of the trivia questions that gets asked every once in a while was who was the first pitcher to win a game for the New York Mets? And I can tell you who that was because he's on our show right now. Jay Hook, who in 1962 won the first game as a pitcher for the New York Mets. How you doing today, Jay?
I'm fine, Mike. Nice to be remembered.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you were one of the, true originals. What was it like being, New York drafted, expansion draft, and ending up with the Mets playing for Casey Stengel?
Well, when I first knew that I'd been drafted, I was driving home from the World Series, actually, in Cincinnati, and my wife and I were in the car, and our kids had gone home with their grandparents, and we heard about Indianapolis. I think we heard that we'd been sold to the New York Mets, and as I looked at it and heard the players that were drafted, I thought, this can be a good experience. And really, I guess even though we were dismal losers that first year, it was a good experience because, it was a group of individuals, Casey Stengel, just a history in himself. So it really, going to New York, I mean, there were a lot more newspapers, a lot of television things. So it wasn't a bad experience at all.
Okay, now you touched upon something. So in 1961, you were a member of the Cincinnati Reds who lost to the Yankees in the World Series. So that must have been a great experience in and of itself.
Well, it was, except that year I had gotten the mumps, of all things, in about June, and it wiped me out for the season. So I didn't get into any of the games in that World Series, and I think we got beat quite handily by the New York Yankees.
Yeah. You know, one thing I almost forgot about this, but there was a book by Jim Brosnan.
Right.
How did you react to, to have your Clubhouse Conversations put in print?
Well, Jim was a really interesting guy, and I think he lived in the Chicago area, and I was going to grad school then at Northwestern University, and he really was a very capable writer, and unfortunately, when I came up with the Reds, in 1959, I guess, he at that point went to the bullpen, and so I was kind of the cause of him going to the bullpen, but that turned out okay because he really became a really good relief pitcher. But I got along with Jim very well.
Okay. But did you like the idea of the book, or?
Well, it didn't bother me.
Okay, well that's good.
He didn't have that many things bad to say about me.
All right, so you're drafted by the New York Mets. You do win the first game for the Mets. Well, not the first game you pitched, obviously. It was what, about the 10th game?
I think it was. I think if we'd have lost another game, we'd have set a new record, and if Pittsburgh would have won another game, they would have set a new record for wins at the start of the season.
Of course, it was the Polo Grounds back then, and I know probably most of the people listening to us don't even know what the Polo Grounds was. But it was an interesting ballpark.
It was interesting because it was an old polo field, and the right and left field fences were very close. And then they went back considerable, and left center and right center were very deep, and center field was, I think, 460 feet or something like that.
Yeah, it was, again, a very unusual ballpark. The first time I ever saw a 1-0 game was the second game of a doubleheader, and you started that game. What do you remember about it?
I remember I pitched a pretty good game, but I lost 1-0.
Right, and who did you give up the? How did the first run score, or the only run?
Well, the Pete Rose was the leadoff hitter for the Reds, and in that first at bat, it seems to me it was an opposite field home run, but it might not have been. But it just made it into and I think it was the right field line. I just made it in and just nicked in, and so for a home run.
It was a fly ball, 250 feet, roughly.
Right. And in any other park, it would have just been a pop-up. But in the Polo Grounds, it was a home run. And so that was the only run scored that game. And I was on the losing side of that. And a guy by the name of Jim Maloney, who actually was a friend of mine because I had played with him in Cincinnati, and I've actually seen him at an old timers thing about 3 years ago.
I guess he remembers that game just as well.
He does. He does. He pitched a good game too.
Obviously. And you were one of the few guys to get hit off him.
Did I? I don't
Yes,
remember that.
I looked that up, and I didn't remember that. But, 3 hits, and Jay Hook got one of those 3 hits.
Well, that first year, the pitchers and I had kind of coined a phrase that don't give up a run because you lose a chance for a tie.
Well, how do you go through the season? You lose 120 games in 1962. How do you get up and get to play the next day?
Mike, that's the great thing about baseball is, and you learn this early in your life, I guess, but it's a new game every day. And when I looked at that group of players, I mean, you had Richie Ashburn and Gil Hodges and Frank Thomas and, a bunch of guys that had been, very successful players. And I think, at least my opinion, I never thought we were as bad as our record showed. And with it being a new game every day, you figure, hey, we got a shot the next day. We didn't prove that, but it was kind of an attitude anyway.
Okay. Now, your manager was Casey Stengel.
Correct.
Was Fred Hutchinson your manager at Cincinnati?
He was, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So tell me, what was the difference between, let's say, those two managers?
Well, they both were, I liked both of them. They had a different style. Fred was a very combative guy. I actually had pitched for him out in Seattle I guess it was 1959. The first, he was the manager out there. And mid-year, he was called up to the Reds. And when he was called up to the Reds, I think I was like 10-4 pitching for him in the Coast League. And a week after he got called up to the Reds, he called me up. And that's how I ended up back in the major leagues. So I thought the world of Fred. He was a good competitor. He'd been a good player. He knew a lot about pitching. He was a good hitter. And now on the other side, Casey was like 70 years old when he came to the Mets. And he probably was one of the most astute observers of baseball that I'd ever met. He was extremely quick-witted. He knew the game inside and out. He'd won a bunch of pennants with the Yankees during the 1950s. And he was, I liked him a lot. He and his wife Edna never had any children. And in spring training that first year, we had two kids with us, very little. And whenever we'd go out to dinner, Casey would see us, and he'd come over to talk to our kids. And when we were at press luncheons and things in New York, Joanne and I would sit in the back, and Casey and Edna would come and get our kids, and they would be up in front with Casey. He was a very keen mind. Stengelese was an interesting thing that even though, it was hard to follow at times, it was really Casey talking about a subject, thinking about the next subject he was going to talk about, jumping to that subject, remembering he didn't finish the last subject, and going back. And so it was a bunch of staggered thoughts. But he really knew a lot about baseball.
Back then, of course, we knew you guys weren't going to win the pennant. But in a lot of cases, when you're a 10 or 11-year-old kid, just the fact that you guys were fighting, and you always were fighting for the games, and you were in an awful lot of close games, just happened to be on the wrong side of them. But it was kind of an exciting ball club, and I know it sounds absurd when you lose 120 games, but there was life in that team.
And one of the neat things that you'd recognize, too, growing up in New York, was the Dodgers and the Giants had left, I think, in, 1958, something like that?
Yes.
And so there hadn't been a National League club there for 3 years or whatever it was. And in 62, when we came back and we were caused to be in existence, I think we picked up a lot of those National League fans. And they were a very rabid group of fans. I don't know. You remember all the signs
The
and stuff
placards.
that would go up all over the park, and they were terrific fans. I think even though the Yankees I think were can't remember if they won the pennant in '62 or not, but I think we drew almost as many fans as the Yankees, and they were winners and we were losers.
No, Polo Grounds was an exciting place to be back then. Your whole life wasn't baseball. You got a master's degree, you said?
Yeah, I went on and I studied engineering undergraduate, and then went on and did graduate work in engineering at Northwestern University in Illinois.
So what did you do after your baseball career was over?
Well, I went to work for Chrysler after I was interested in cars and souping up cars and making them go fast and all that stuff. And I went with Chrysler for a few years. Then I went with a company named Rockwell International, and they did a lot of the space shuttle, and they were known for a lot of the rocket propulsion and stuff they did. I worked in the automotive side of that business. I think I was with Rockwell for 9 years and headed up a couple of divisions for them, and then I became a vice president with a company by the name of Masco, where they hired me away from Rockwell. I think when they gave me 5 or 6 companies to run right away. And I think when I retired early, I had 20 companies that were reporting to me.
I mean, that's amazing because a lot of times I think some people think baseball players or athletes in general don't have a mind upstairs, and obviously you're a pretty smart guy.
Well, I don't know about that. But, I don't know if you remember when the Tigers had a big losing year. Maybe it was Al Trammell was the manager. Maybe, 6 or 8 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. Well, my wife and I were out in Colorado in September, and we got back. We actually live on a farm now in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. But we got back, and there must have been 20 messages on on our answering machine of writers around the country wanting to talk about what's it like to lose 120 games, because the Tigers were close to losing that many. And the Mets must have been giving out my name to talk or something. But anyway, the Los Angeles Times asked me to write an op-ed piece, and I agreed to do it, and I did. And it was around that subject. And this, really what I wrote about was I took the Mets as an example and picked a number of players off that team who went on to have very successful careers after baseball. And it was kind of fun to do. Roger Craig went on to be a pitching coach and then a manager. Craig Anderson went on to be like an assistant athletic director at Lehigh. Ken McKenzie went on to be a baseball coach and some other stuff at Yale. And it really was fun. Richie Ashburn became a radio personality and announced the Phillies games for years and years.
Let's not forget Gil Hodges.
Gil Hodges became a manager. Roadblock Jones became a sheriff of a county out in Kansas, and then became a state representative. And I did a bunch of stuff, and it was your point was well made that even though you have a baseball career, it's not the end of your life at age 35 or something.
Thank you very much for being in our show and bringing back the memories of the New York Mets. Again, a lot of us. Do you guys ever have reunions? The '62 Mets?
No.
No.
I was back. I was invited back to the baseball writers' dinner in New York after like the 50th year anniversary, and Frank Thomas was there and Al Jackson was there. And, I know you all see Ed Kranepool quite a bit because he lives in the New York area. And there again, Ed Kranepool formed a corporation after he'd done a lot of things and did very well with that. So no, we don't have that sort of thing, but it is fun when you have the opportunity to get together and talk to guys. I really had an interesting time with Al Jackson, during that time because we had to go over to New Jersey and we spent a lot of time in the car together, and it was really fun. We've stayed in touch with he and Nadine. They live in Port St. Lucie. Then I think he's probably at spring training again this year.
Right. He's always working for the Mets. Listen, when you, Roger Craig, and Al Jackson pitched, we had a chance to win. So we thank you for that.
I think that year, I think I lost 12 or 13 games by 1 run. Now, they weren't all 2-1 games.
No.
But we had a shot anyway.
Here's one thing maybe I should bring up for those younger people in the audience. Do you have any idea how many complete games you pitched in 1962?
Yeah, 12.
Right. The whole Met team this year had about 7 complete games.
Yeah, that has been such a change in baseball. And one thing I should mention, I was, if you ever see a publication called Collegiate Baseball,
okay,
just take a glance. There's a February edition of that. A friend of mine wrote an article about injuries to pitchers, the Tommy John kind of stuff, and he inquired me about what it was like when I was pitching, and that our trainer was a guy by the name of Gus Mauch, who had come from the Yankees. And back then, you didn't seem to have those kind of injuries. But boy, in the 90s, they just escalated. And what John Magarian's the guy's name that wrote the article, he did some research on what were potential causes of those things. And it was a very interesting piece. And, I feel bad for the guys. I think, you've got a pitcher that's just coming back from that last year, I think.
Matt Harvey, yes.
Max Harvey. Didn't he have Tommy John surgery?
Yeah, he's coming back. He just pitched a couple of days ago.
That's what I thought that. And it was interesting. And for young guys looking at that, it's something to consider as young pitchers are working toward improving themselves,
Okay, well, listen, thank you again for sharing your memories. I hope you're enjoying life right now. And I know our audience, and, we have a lot of National League fans here on an audience, and I think they appreciate your contributions to the New York Mets.
Well, thank you, Michael, and it's nice to speak with you. I don't talk baseball much anymore except the grandsons, but it's a lot of fun.
Well, I'm sure you have a lot of stories to tell.
Thank you.
Thank you.